Elijah Ward never set out to live alone. It just sort of happened. First, his wife passed. Cancer, swift and cruel. Then the kids moved away. One to New York, the other overseas. Friends scattered. And soon the quiet wasn't just something he noticed. It became something he lived inside of. He settled into a slow rhythm on the edge of the forest near Pine Brook Ridge. A little cabin with warped wood siding, a porch that creaked when the wind blew, and enough land to grow some vegetables and chop his own firewood. He wasn't bitter, just tired. But he liked the quiet until it ended. It was late November. The sky had turned white-gray, and the first dusting of snow had come early. Elijah was chopping wood when he heard something, a whimper, not loud, not human. He froze, axe still in hand, head tilting toward the tree line. There it was again, a broken sound, strained, pained. He followed it. About 30 feet into the woods, tangled in a mess of thorn brush and frozen vines, lay a fox. It was young, but not a pup. Its red coat was matted and dull, one leg bent at an angle that was clearly wrong. Blood stained the snow beneath it. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked rhythm. Elijah had seen many foxes over the years, but none like this. This one looked at him, straight at him, and didn't blink, didn't run, didn't even bare its teeth. He should have walked away. It was wild. It could be diseased. It could die in hours anyway. But something in him, something instinctive, older than reason, made him take off his coat and kneel slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you," he whispered. He didn't know why he said it. The fox couldn't understand him. Could it? He carried it back to the cabin. It didn't fight, didn't make a sound. He laid it near the fire, cleaned the wound as best he could, and splinted the leg with pieces of kindling and strips from an old towel. He gave it water, then chicken broth, then sat beside it in silence as the wind howled outside. The first night he expected it to die. The second night he expected it to run. But by the third night, the fox was still there, breathing, watching, alive. Elijah didn't name it, didn't talk to it, didn't try to tame it. He just let it stay. He fed it scraps. He gave it space. When it began walking again, limping at first, he opened the door and let it decide. Sometimes it wandered outside for hours, but always came back. At night, it curled near the hearth, eyes open, ears twitching, silent, present. It stayed for 13 days, and then, one morning, it was gone. Elijah stood at the door a long while, looking into the snow-covered woods. He wasn't surprised, wasn't hurt. He just nodded once and whispered, "Good luck out there," and went back inside. Years passed. Seasons spun like wheels. The ache in Elijah's knees grew stronger. His hair thinned. His eyesight blurred around the edges. The quiet returned, heavier than before, but somehow not as empty. Sometimes he'd see flashes of red in the woods, too far to be sure, too fast to follow, but he always stopped what he was doing, watched, listened, waited. Then, on a cold morning in late winter, 5 years to the day since he found her, Elijah opened the door and froze. There, at the edge of the porch, stood the fox. Full grown now, beautiful, her fur thick and healthy, chest puffed, tail sweeping behind her like fire. She stared at him, eyes locked. He stepped out slowly, heart thudding in his chest. "You came back," he whispered. Then he saw it. She wasn't alone. In her mouth, gently cradled between her teeth, was a bundle, fur, tiny, squirming, a pup. She placed it on the porch with incredible care, then backed away 3 steps and sat, watching, waiting. Elijah knelt. The baby fox squeaked softly, its eyes barely open, its body trembling from the cold. He looked at the mother. She didn't move, didn't run, didn't growl. She trusted him completely. He gathered the pup in his hands and rose to his feet, stepping inside, leaving the door slightly open. The mother didn't follow, didn't need to. She had delivered the most precious part of her world to the only human who had ever helped her. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He fed the pup milk and wrapped it in fleece, and every hour when he checked the window, the mother was still there, sitting in the snow, watching, until sunrise. Then she turned and walked back into the woods. Elijah didn't think he'd still be alive when spring came. That winter had taken more out of him than any before. His hands hurt when he chopped wood. His knees burned on cold mornings. Sometimes he'd forget what he stood up for. But the pup kept him moving, kept him focused. It was a tiny, trembling thing, barely bigger than his palm the day she brought it to him. He didn't know if it was male or female at first. He didn't care. It squeaked and squirmed and refused to eat from a bowl, so he fed it by hand, drop by drop, like he was pouring life into something fragile and fading. And every time it looked at him, with eyes not yet fully open, Elijah felt something break open inside his chest. He named it Ash, for its soft gray coat, and the way it arrived like something pulled from the edge of a dying fire. The mother didn't return for a week. Elijah looked for her every morning, but the woods gave up nothing. No rustle, no flash of red, no paw prints in the snow, only silence. Until the 8th night, he was sitting in his chair beside the fire, Ash curled under a flannel blanket on his lap, when he felt it. Not a sound, but a presence. He looked up, and there she was, sitting just outside the window, watching, unmoving, as if she needed to see it for herself, that the pup was safe, that he was doing it right. He opened the door slowly, stepped outside. She didn't flinch, didn't run, just looked at him and blinked once. Then, silently, she turned and vanished into the woods. Ash grew quickly, faster than any dog Elijah had ever raised. Within weeks, she was darting around the cabin, chewing through chair legs, scratching at the door, yipping with a voice that didn't know if it belonged to the wild or the domestic. She had her mother's eyes, gold-flecked and too intelligent. Her ears were always up, alert. She was quiet when she wanted to be, but mostly she was chaos, beautiful, untamed chaos. He didn't try to cage her. He didn't try to train her. He just let her be. He built a fenced area around the cabin, not to trap her, but to buy time. Time before she realized she didn't belong behind walls. Time before the forest called her name. Sometimes the mother would return, never close, never more than a shadow at the edge of the trees. But Elijah always saw her, and she always saw him. Spring turned to summer. Ash learned how to leap over the fence. She'd disappear into the trees for hours, sometimes days. Elijah would worry, but she always came back, dirty, excited, bounding through the grass like a creature stitched together from lightning and leaves. She'd sleep on the porch, sometimes beside the fire, but more often under the stars. He knew she was going. She was leaving him a little more every day. And that was okay, because he never expected her to stay. But she always came back. One morning he woke up to find 2 foxes outside the cabin, Ash and another, smaller, darker, male. They were circling each other in that careful, animal way, half game, half dance. When Elijah opened the door, they both stopped, looked at him, then darted into the woods. That was the day he knew she had found her own world now. But that evening, Ash returned alone and sat on the porch, tail wrapped around her legs. Elijah didn't say anything. He just sat beside her, creaking down into the old rocker, listening to the wind. She leaned into his side once, just once, then stood and padded off into the darkness. She didn't come back for weeks. The cabin felt bigger, too big. Elijah still made tea for two, still looked out the window in the mornings, still found loose tufts of fur beneath the couch. Then, one dusk in early fall, he stepped outside and saw 3 sets of eyes glowing at the edge of the trees. Ash and 2 pups, small, curious, twitching noses and quick feet. Elijah didn't move. Ash stepped forward slowly, and the pups followed, bounding through tall grass until they were right at the steps. They didn't climb, just sat, watching, waiting. Ash nudged them forward, then sat herself, as if to say, "They're yours now, too." Elijah's hands shook as he knelt. He didn't try to touch them. He just smiled. The pups darted off after a minute, and Ash with them. But he knew what it meant. She hadn't just come back. She had brought her children to meet the man who once saved her life. The visits became tradition. Every season she returned, sometimes alone, sometimes with pups, sometimes just a shadow between trees. The years rolled forward, slow and soft. Elijah stopped counting them. He marked time in foxes, in how often she came, in how many followed her, in how many dared to come close. He grew slower, quieter, but never lonely, because even when they didn't come, he felt them. The forest breathed differently now. It watched over him, and he watched over it. Then, one winter morning, Elijah didn't wake. They found him in his chair by the fire, mug still warm in his hand, an old blanket across his knees. Peaceful, eyes closed, no sign of struggle, just a man who had lived his last chapter exactly as he wanted. But what happened next? That's what people would talk about for years, because the morning after he passed, a neighbor came to check on him and found paw prints, dozens, all around the cabin, on the porch, across the snow, leading to and from the door. Fox prints. And in the doorway, a strange offering, a bundle of moss, berries, and feathers arranged neatly, deliberately, and beside it, an old strip of flannel, frayed and faded, from a blanket Elijah hadn't used in years. There were no foxes in sight, but their message was clear. He had been one of them, not in body, but in spirit, and in their world, in the silent kingdom of wind and snow and trees. He would never be forgotten. It had been nearly a decade since Elijah Ward passed, but the hill where his cabin once stood had never really gone quiet. Locals called it Fox Hill, and even those who didn't believe in stories found themselves speaking softer when they passed it. Something about the way the wind moved through those trees, slow, like breath. Something about the way the grass bent, as if flattened by paws no one saw. No one lived there anymore. The forest had taken the house back. Vines had crept up what was left of the porch posts, and moss covered the stone chimney. But the bench still stood beneath the old apple tree, maintained by someone, no one knew who. The bench was never empty for long. On one particular morning in late September, it was occupied by a woman in her early 30s, wearing a forest ranger's coat and holding a worn leather journal in her lap. Her name was Claire Thomas, and she'd driven nearly 300 miles to be there. She wasn't sure what she expected. Maybe a whisper of the stories she'd grown up hearing. Her grandfather had once met Elijah. He used to say, "That man wasn't afraid of the wild." He listened to it. Claire didn't fully believe in legends, but she believed in the feeling they left behind. She was there to write, not an article, a grant proposal. Her idea was to create a small sanctuary around Fox Hill. No development, no campsites, just protected land, a place where people could visit, sit in silence, and maybe, just maybe, feel something they forgot they were looking for. She opened her journal, but before she could put pen to paper, something moved in the tree line. Her breath caught, a flash of red, then silver, two shapes, small, fluid, watching, foxes, young ones. They didn't approach, just stared from the shadows. Claire didn't move. She knew enough not to. After a minute, the smaller one, with a curious white patch over its eye, stepped forward. Just a few feet, then sat and waited. Claire reached slowly into her coat pocket and pulled out a granola bar. She didn't toss it, didn't bribe, just placed it on the ground and stepped back. The fox blinked, then trotted forward, snatched the bar, and darted off. The second one followed. Claire smiled, her heart thudding. She'd seen wild animals before. It came with the job. But this felt different. It felt like permission. She sat down again and began to write. That evening, Claire set up her tent just outside the clearing. No fire, just a lantern, her sleeping bag, and the soft hum of crickets in the trees. Around midnight, she woke to a sound, soft, rhythmic, not threatening. She sat up slowly and peeked through the flap. There, not 20 feet away, a full-grown fox stood by the bench. It was older, thicker neck, lean legs, slow movements. Its fur was dusted with gray, but its eyes burned with gold, and in its mouth a scrap of fabric. The fox padded forward and placed it at the base of the bench, then sat. Claire didn't move, didn't blink. After a moment, the fox turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees like a shadow swallowed by wind. Claire crawled out of her tent, heart hammering. She approached the bench. The scrap of fabric was worn flannel, red and brown checks, edges frayed by time. It took her a moment to understand. It was from a shirt just like the one Elijah Ward was wearing in the photo that still hung in the Pine Brook Museum, the only photo anyone had of him with the fox cub, Ash. Claire fell to her knees. The stars above the trees spun in silence, and for the first time in her adult life, she believed. The next morning, Claire packed her things and left quietly, stopping only to place one small note on the bench, pinned beneath a stone. It read, "Thank you for the trust. I won't let the world build over this." The forest didn't reply, but the wind moved softly through the leaves, as if it understood. Claire returned to Fox Hill 3 weeks later. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Her grant proposal had been approved faster than expected. A combination of perfect timing and a well-placed call from her retired professor, who had once taught environmental storytelling and believed Claire's passion was the kind the world needed more of. Now, she had the resources to begin her project. But money wasn't what brought her back. It was the fox. That image had stayed with her. The golden-eyed animal, the strip of flannel at the bench, the silent understanding. It wasn't just a legend anymore. She'd seen it, felt it, and now she needed to make sure no one destroyed it. Not just the land, but the memory. She spent her first few days clearing brush around the property and mapping out paths for a low-impact foot trail. No concrete, no fences, just markers and benches placed to encourage stillness. At night, she camped near the apple tree. The air was crisp with autumn, the ground layered with dry leaves. Twice she saw foxes. Once, a shadow moved so fast through the edge of her vision she questioned if it had been real. On the 5th day, while removing a rotted stump near what remained of the chimney, her shovel hit something solid. She stopped, kneeled, brushed the dirt away. It was wood, old, warped, not natural. A box, no larger than a loaf of bread, buried under almost a foot of soil. She dug around it carefully, prying it free and setting it on her tarp. It wasn't locked. The lid was swollen shut from years of rain, but she eased it open with a multi-tool. Inside were bundles of folded paper, sealed in plastic, and one thing on top, resting gently across them, a photograph. Elijah, younger than in the museum photo, standing beside the cabin, holding a mug, squinting at the sun, and curled at his feet, a tiny fox pup, Ash. Claire sat back, breath caught in her throat. She touched the photo like it might dissolve, then opened the papers. They were journal entries, dozens of them, handwritten in neat, looping script, dated over a span of 12 years. Elijah had kept everything, notes about Ash, her behavior, her pups. Every time she returned, every offering she left, every strange moment that didn't fit into what the world expected wild animals to do. Claire read deep into the night. One entry, dated just 2 months before his death, read, "She brought a feather today, not chewed, not broken, just laid it at the step and waited." I don't know what it means. Maybe it's just what she found, or maybe it's how she says goodbye. Another, "I dreamt I was one of them, running through the trees with a mouth full of wind and dirt, and I woke up with paw prints on the porch I didn't recognize, smaller than hers, a new one maybe." The final entry was short, just a sentence. "If they ever come, the ones who truly want to listen, let this tell them I was real." Claire wept quietly beneath the trees. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she knew, without question, that she'd found something sacred, something beyond explanation, something the world had tried to pave over 1,000 times. But it had survived, because of Elijah, because of Ash, because the forest remembers the ones who treat it with kindness. Claire scanned and cataloged the journal, but left the original pages sealed in a climate-safe box near the bench. She didn't want them in a museum. They belonged here. She created a digital version for the educational center she was planning, with a small corner reserved for a single line. "You don't need to speak to be remembered. You only need to be honest." One day, as she sat editing the transcript beneath the apple tree, a small group of school kids passed through the clearing, part of a nature walk with a local teacher. One of them, a boy maybe 8 years old, stopped and pointed toward the woods. "Miss Claire," he whispered, "there's something in the trees." She looked up. There, barely visible between the trunks, stood a fox. Not the same one, not Ash, but something in the way it held itself, tall, steady, deliberate, made her sit up straighter. The boy stared. "Do you think it's watching us?" Claire smiled. "No," she said softly. "I think it's remembering." The fox blinked once, then turned and vanished. The sanctuary became known as Elijah's Crossing. No gift shop, no paved lot, just a winding path through quiet trees and a bench beneath a weathered apple tree with one simple message etched into wood. He listened, and the wild remembered. Every year, more came, not because it was famous, but because someone they knew had gone and come back different, calmer, kinder, like they'd heard something the rest of the world had forgotten how to say. Sometimes it was a whisper in the leaves. Sometimes it was silence so deep you could feel your own heartbeat. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was a flash of red fur disappearing between the trees. 5 years later, Elijah's Crossing had become something the town didn't know it needed. and couldn't imagine losing. It wasn't a tourist trap. It didn't have billboards or guided tours. It didn't have Wi-Fi or parking lots. It had trees, benches, paths made of soft bark and stone, birds that didn't scatter at footsteps, and foxes, seen more often than not, slipping between trunks, trailing through mist, watching from ridgelines with quiet, knowing eyes. People came not to post photos, but to breathe, to remember. Some came to grieve. Some came to listen. Some didn't know why they came, only that when they left, something had shifted inside. Claire still ran the sanctuary. She lived in a small wooden cabin built on the far edge of the property, just beyond where Elijah's old chimney still stood. She kept a garden, walked the trails at dawn, wrote when it rained, and every Sunday she visited the bench beneath the apple tree and reread a page from Elijah's journal. She never brought anyone there unless they were ready. But one spring morning, a child came who didn't wait for permission. His name was Caleb, 10 years old. Freckles, mismatched shoelaces, the kind of boy who asked questions that adults didn't know how to answer. His father had recently passed. Cancer, same as Elijah's wife. Claire had met his mother once when they came for a grief support program hosted at the sanctuary's edge. The mother smiled politely. Caleb didn't speak much, but his eyes soaked in everything. That morning, Claire found him sitting at the bench beneath the apple tree. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he sat with the stillness of someone who had been invited anyway. In his lap was a sketchbook. He was drawing something. Claire approached gently. "Hi," she said. He didn't look up. "Fox," he said. Claire tilted her head. "You saw one?" He nodded. "Big one. Looked old, but not tired." She blinked. "When?" she asked. Caleb pointed. "There, 5 minutes ago. It left this." He handed her a feather. Not from a bird. A foxtail feather, what naturalists called the delicate tip hairs that sometimes came loose in early spring. Claire took it in both hands. "Did it do anything else?" she asked. Caleb shook his head. "Just looked at me, and then looked there." He pointed to the base of the apple tree. Claire stepped forward. There, half covered by moss, was something buried in the roots, a glint of glass. She knelt, heart hammering, and brushed the soil away. It was a jar, old, sealed with wax. Inside, folded paper, curled with age. She pried it open slowly and eased the paper free. It wasn't Elijah's handwriting. It was older, sharper, precise. The letter read, "If someone finds this, it means she trusted you. This isn't just land, it's memory. She gave me her trust once, and I gave it to him. Now it's yours. Don't let the quiet be forgotten. A." Claire sat back, breath caught in her chest. "A. Ash?" She turned to Caleb. He was drawing again. "What are you sketching?" she asked softly. He flipped the page and showed her. A fox, standing beside a girl, and behind them a man, bearded, smiling, with a cup of tea in one hand. She whispered, "How did you know what he looked like?" Caleb shrugged. "I saw him," he said. Claire went still. "Where?" He pointed to the woods. "Right before I saw the fox. They were standing together." Claire's voice dropped to a whisper. "What did he say?" Caleb paused. "Nothing." He looked back at his page. "But I heard something anyway." Claire sat beside him. They watched the wind roll through the grass, watched the trees sway like they were breathing. "What did you hear, Caleb?" He didn't look up from his sketch. "Thank you." That night, Claire placed the feather and the letter inside the sanctuary archive, in the same weatherproof box where Elijah's journal still rested. She added a note. "Legacy is not what we build. It's what we leave behind when we listen. He listened, so did she, and now, so will I. Caleb returned every month, always with a new drawing. He never asked to come, he just showed up. Sometimes he'd bring small stones, sometimes feathers. Once, a pine cone he swore was special. Claire always left the items in the offering circle beneath the tree, a ring of moss-covered stones that had appeared slowly over the years, one by one, as if the forest itself was building something back. One summer, Claire found a new marker placed at the back of the sanctuary, near a rise where wildflowers grew. It hadn't been made by human hands. Small bones, twigs, bark twisted like ribbon. In the center, a flake of obsidian. Foxes don't build shrines. At least, that's what the textbooks say. But when Claire returned the next day, someone had placed a pine cone beside it, just like the one Caleb had offered. She didn't touch it. She just nodded and whispered, "We remember." Elijah's crossing still stands today. No one knows where the foxes came from. No one knows where they go. But if you sit still enough, long enough, you might catch a glimpse of red fur disappearing between the birches, or a boy sitting beneath the tree sketching someone you thought was just a story. Or, if you're very, very lucky, a feeling you've been missing. Something older than words, something wild, something that remembers you even if you've forgotten yourself. Years passed. The trails at Elijah's crossing grew softer with time and footsteps, but the air never lost its stillness. The trees stood like sentinels. The apple tree bloomed a little brighter each spring, and the foxes, whether seen or just sensed, never left. Claire was now in her late 40s. The streaks in her hair had turned silver around the edges, but her hands were strong and her eyes sharper than ever. She still lived in the little cabin near the ruins of Elijah's hearth. She still rose with the sun and walked the perimeter in silence each morning, and every evening she lit a single lantern by the bench under the apple tree, just as Elijah once had, back when the world still thought no one was watching. But one Monday in early autumn, a letter arrived. It came not by email nor courier. Just a folded envelope slid beneath the door of the Welcome Center. There was no name, no return address, just a stamp, a date, and a heavy legal logo that made Claire's gut twist before she even opened it. It was a development notice. A private firm, one Claire had never heard of, had submitted plans for a residential nature community just beyond the sanctuary's borders. Technically outside the protected zone, but close enough to threaten everything: roads, fences, grading, noise, light, and worst of all, foot traffic that would pierce the forest's heart. Claire spent the next week in meetings. She filed objections, spoke at the town council, brought documentation, maps, testimonials. She showed them photographs of visitors who had cried while standing in the grove, kids who'd left drawings, veterans who wrote letters afterward saying they hadn't felt peace in years until that visit. But none of it mattered. Legally, the land was outside the sanctuary's reach, and the developer had found a loophole. They were going to build, unless she could find a reason that would stop them. Caleb was 21 now, taller than Claire, lean and thoughtful, always carrying a satchel filled with sketchbooks. He had taken over the volunteer program and ran workshops for local teens, teaching them to draw what they felt, not just what they saw. When he heard about the development, he didn't say anything at first. But that night, Claire found him sitting at the old bench, hands clenched in his lap. "She trusted us," he said, barely louder than the wind. Claire knew who he meant. Ash. "She gave us her world," he continued, voice shaking. "And now they're going to pave over it." Claire sat beside him. For a long time, they said nothing. Then Caleb turned. "Do you still have the old trail cams?" Claire nodded slowly. That night, they placed all of them in the deepest part of the forest, past even where the public was allowed, the places Claire had always felt watched, but never intruded, the oldest trees, the coldest glades, the parts the foxes had claimed long ago. And then they waited. On the third night, one of the cameras triggered. At 2:11 a.m., in grainy infrared, a fox walked into frame. Not just any fox. This one was massive, bigger than Ash. Fur thick like a winter coat, tail like fire, eyes glowing like gold embers. It walked to the base of a cedar tree and stopped, then looked directly at the camera. It didn't move for a full minute, just stared. And then, without breaking eye contact, it turned and did something none of them had ever seen before. It dug, not frantically, not for food, deliberately, measured, and unearthed something, a shape, square, wooden. Then it backed away and vanished into the trees. Caleb and Claire hiked out at dawn. It took them hours to find it, but when they did, they stood in silence for a long time. At the base of the cedar, barely beneath the surface, was a weather-worn wooden box. Inside, a faded journal, not Elijah's, older, a rusted metal tag engraved only with the letter A, and a sketch, crumbling with age, of a fox curled around a child. Claire recognized the handwriting from the letter she'd found years ago in the jar. Ash. It was her mark, and it was older than Elijah. She had been here long before him, longer than anyone thought, and somehow she had been watching them long enough to know when they needed her most. Claire and Caleb brought the contents back and presented them at the final council hearing. But this time, they didn't argue. They just showed the photo, the journal, the camera footage. And then Claire stood before the room and said only this: "I don't think you need to understand what this place is. You just need to know it remembers, and that it protects those who protect it. If you build here, I don't think it'll let you forget what you took." The room was silent. No one laughed. The developer pulled their bid that night. 2 weeks later, Claire walked the deep trail again. It was misty, quiet. She stopped at the cedar tree and placed something at its base. A new feather, fresh, not one she found, one that had been left on her windowsill that morning. She placed it down gently, then whispered, "We're still listening." Behind her, something moved in the trees. She didn't turn. She just smiled. Because some voices don't need words. Some bonds outlive the ones who made them. And some guardians never truly leave. They just wait until they're needed again. The first time Claire saw the man, she thought he was lost. He stood at the entrance to Elijah's crossing just past dawn. Tall, thin, maybe late 40s, in a weathered coat and old hiking boots. He had no backpack, no camera, just a small leather notebook tucked under one arm and a face that looked like it hadn't slept in days. Claire was on her morning trail sweep. She paused when she saw him. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man turned slowly. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray. Something about them was unsettling, not dangerous, just deeply out of place, like they belonged to someone who'd seen something he still couldn't explain. He stared at her for a moment too long, then asked, "Is this where the fox lives?" Claire blinked. "We have a few," she said cautiously, "but they're wild. We don't keep them. They come and go." He shook his head once. "Not a fox. The fox." She studied him. "You mean Ash?" He smiled faintly. So it wasn't just a dream. Claire felt a chill crawl up her arms. He stepped forward, reached into his coat, and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. Slowly, carefully, he unfolded it and held it out. It was a photograph, old, curled at the edges, black and white. A man standing beside a child, and behind them, barely visible at the edge of the frame, a fox. Claire's breath caught. She recognized the child. It was Elijah, much younger, maybe 8 or 9, standing with a man who must have been his father. The man in the photo looked almost identical to the one in front of her. She looked up. "You're—" He nodded. "His nephew. Name's Daniel." Claire's mouth was dry. Elijah never mentioned family. Daniel gave a soft, tired chuckle. "He wouldn't. He wasn't close to any of us. Moved out here before I was born. But I grew up hearing whispers. My dad used to talk about the man who walked with foxes." Claire nodded slowly, heart pounding. "I thought it was just a story," Daniel continued, "until last year." She watched him closely. "What happened last year?" He looked at her, and for a moment he didn't speak. Then, "I started having dreams." Claire froze. "In them," Daniel said, "I was walking through trees I'd never seen before. I could hear footsteps, but they weren't human. And every time I turned, there was this fox, staring at me, same gold eyes, always waiting, never leaving." Claire's mouth opened slightly. "I've heard that dream before." Daniel tilted his head. "So it's real." She nodded. "We think it's how she finds people who are supposed to be part of this." Daniel looked down at the photo in his hand. "I didn't come for stories," he said. "I came because I think I have something I'm supposed to give you." He reached into his coat again, pulled out the notebook. "I found this in my father's attic. He'd hidden it inside an old birdhouse. I didn't even realize what it was at first." He handed it to her. Claire opened the first page. It was filled with tight cursive, notes and sketches, diagrams of fox tracks, even lines of poetry. At the bottom of the page was a signature, Elias Ward, Elijah's father. Claire's throat tightened. This predates everything," she whispered. "This was before the sanctuary, before the cabin." Daniel nodded. "Turns out Elijah wasn't the first one Ash trusted." That night, Claire read through every page. The notebook was a map, not just of land, but of time. Elias had chronicled his own strange experiences, fox sightings, offerings left on his porch, dreams that led him to buried items, drawings his son made that mirrored what he saw in his sleep. One passage stood out, written in fading ink. "She is not one fox. She is many, or one that changes, or one that returns. I do not know what she is, but I know she is watching." Another, toward the end. "Elijah doesn't speak much, but I see it in his eyes. He hears them too." Claire turned the final page. It was a sketch, a tree she recognized, the old cedar deep in the forest. At the base of the drawing, a symbol. 2 M-shaped lines crossed with a tail-like curve. The same symbol Ash had left long ago in a patch of snow. The same shape etched in bone and bark across the sanctuary. She realized then this wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a path, a long, slow unfolding, one person to the next, from Elias to Elijah to her, and now maybe to Caleb. The next morning, Daniel was gone. No note, no goodbye, only the photograph left on the bench beneath the apple tree. Claire picked it up with trembling hands, and as she looked at Elijah's young face, at the shadow of the fox behind him, she knew the circle wasn't closing. It was just widening. That afternoon, Caleb returned from town holding a package. "No return address," he said, "but I think it's for you." Inside, a folded sheet of paper and an object wrapped in linen. The note read, "For the one who listens. My father never knew what to do with it. I think you will." Claire unwrapped the object slowly. It was a pendant, hand-carved from smooth obsidian, strung on old leather. The symbol from Elias's journal etched into it, 2 peaks and a tail. She slipped it over her neck, and that night, as the stars came out and the wind moved through the trees like a living thing, Claire stood at the center of the grove and whispered, "We remember." From somewhere deep in the woods, a fox barked, once, then silence, and in that silence the forest smiled. It started with the storm, not the kind that rolls in with thunder and black skies. No, this one was quiet, thick mist at dawn rising like steam from the soil, pine needles trembling, though the wind was still, the kind of weather that felt like it came from under the earth, not above it. Claire knew something was wrong before the call came. It was instinct now, honed by decades of walking the same trails, hearing the same birds, seeing how the forest breathed. That morning, everything felt off. The foxes were gone, no paw prints on the trail, no movement in the brush, no eyes between the trees. Claire stood at the edge of the cedar grove and waited, but the forest didn't answer. The call came at 8:12 a.m. A boundary sensor had been tripped. A drone, one they didn't authorize, had flown low over the sanctuary before vanishing. Claire and Caleb were on site within minutes. They traced the signal to the southern ridge, near the only part of the sanctuary that bordered private land. What they found made Claire's stomach turn. A flagged marker had been staked into the soil. Bright orange tape. New. Caleb pulled out his phone and scanned the GPS. "It's just outside protected boundaries," he said quietly. Claire said nothing. She was staring at the tree beside the marker, a tall red maple. Carved into its bark, fresh and rough, were the initials WC. Claire hadn't heard that name in years, but she remembered it. Winston Carrington, a developer, private equity real estate. He'd been behind the first attempt to buy the land years ago, the bid that was pulled after Claire presented Ash's journal and the footage of the fox unearthing the box. And now he was back. They filed a formal complaint immediately, but Carrington's lawyers responded the next day. The drone was a topographic survey. Legal. The flag was temporary and unrelated. Legal. No current development was planned. But Claire knew better. This was a warning shot, a test, and the sanctuary was suddenly in danger again. That evening Caleb walked the perimeter alone. He carried a flashlight, a notebook, and the obsidian pendant Claire had passed to him that morning. "It's yours now," she'd said. "It chooses the listener." He wore it tucked beneath his shirt, cool against his chest, and every so often he'd touch it without thinking, like checking to see if it was still real. The forest was silent, but not empty. Caleb could feel it, not fear, not danger, something else. He reached the edge of the cedar grove, the oldest part of the forest, a place even Claire didn't visit after dark. He paused, breathed, then stepped inside. The trees here didn't just grow, they stood. Massive trunks like stone columns, each with bark patterned like the rings of history, moss draped like scarves, the air colder than it should have been. He walked 10 paces in, then stopped. There, at the base of the largest cedar, sat something small, dark, unmoving. He crouched. It was a bird, dead, a mourning dove, soft gray feathers soaked from dew, but its body, it hadn't been torn, no bite, no blood, just placed, gently, almost ceremonially, Beside it, a small stack of pebbles. Caleb blinked. It was an offering, but not for him. He looked up and froze. In the shadows ahead, half covered by ferns, a fox watched him. Older, eyes like gold flame. But this one looked different, taller, sharper. The fur along its back jagged like fire. It stared, then turned and disappeared. Back at the cabin, Claire was waiting. He told her everything. Her expression didn't change. She simply walked to the old drawer where she kept the protected pages of Elijah's and Elias's journals. She pulled one out, yellowed with age, folded into quarters. She handed it to Caleb. He opened it slowly. It was a sketch, a fox, towering, otherworldly, fur like knives. At its feet, birds, pebbles, bones. Below it, scribbled in red pencil, "When they come again, she will rise. Not as before, not to speak, but to choose." Caleb looked up. "She's watching the line," Claire said. "She knows they're coming." 2 days later, the drone returned, but this time it didn't leave. It crashed straight into a pine. Claire and Caleb retrieved the wreckage. There were claw marks across the camera casing. No one could explain it. No animal climbs like that. No animal targets machinery. And yet, the night after the crash, the forest woke. Claire described it later like a pressure shift, like the whole sanctuary was holding its breath. Birds moved strangely. The deer vanished. The trees creaked with voices they'd never made before. At 3:12 a.m., the sensor alarms tripped all at once. All borders, simultaneous, motion everywhere. Claire and Caleb scrambled outside with flashlights and radios, scanning the darkness. And then they saw them. Foxes, dozens, in every direction, on paths, in the fields, at the edge of the cabin, but not running, not scared, just watching, waiting, as if answering a call. And then silence. As quickly as they appeared, they vanished. No attack, no blood, just presence, and one final sign. On the doorstep of the Welcome Center, someone, or something, had placed the rusted orange survey flag, torn, folded into the shape of a fox. Claire held it in her hands for a long time, then whispered, "They're not afraid of us anymore." The Carrington team didn't wait long. 3 days after the drone crash, a convoy of black SUVs rolled up to the gravel road that bordered the southern edge of the sanctuary. 4 men stepped out, suits, boots, sunglasses, not townfolk, not hikers, the kind of men who spoke in contracts and loopholes. They didn't carry blueprints. They didn't need to. The intent was written in their presence. Claire met them with calm eyes and a steel heart. She didn't stand in the road. She stood in the center of it. "You can turn around," she said, her voice like wind through dry grass. The tallest man, with gray at his temples and a jaw too square to be friendly, stepped forward. "We're within our legal rights. You're not within your moral ones." He smiled thinly. "That's never stopped anyone before." Claire didn't move. Behind her, Caleb stepped out from the trees. No threats, no weapons, just the obsidian pendant around his neck and something in his eyes that wasn't there last year. A stillness, a patience, like the trees themselves had grown into his bones. "We're not alone here," he said quietly. The man in the suit raised an eyebrow. "Then who is?" No one answered. Not yet. That night, the forest changed. It wasn't just the foxes. It was the air, heavier, charged like a sky about to crack open. Claire lit no lanterns that night. Instead, she placed the old pendant in the circle beneath the apple tree. She left a page from Elijah's journal beside it. One Caleb had picked. "They won't understand what she is, not until it's too late. But the ones who listen, they'll know. The fox doesn't fight like man does. She doesn't scream, she waits, watches, and when the time is right, she moves like truth, swift, final, remembered. Then Claire waited. At 4:37 a.m., the motion sensors tripped again. This time, only one, the southern border. Caleb was already out the door, boots half tied, flashlight in hand. Claire followed in silence, coat pulled tight, eyes sharp. They moved like shadows between the trees, but before they reached the ridge, they stopped, because there, lit by the beam of Caleb's light, stood a fox, not red, black, coal dark, with a silver blaze across its forehead, standing motionless in the middle of the trail. And behind it, fire, a controlled burn, deliberate, bright flags and fire stakes set in a line. A Carrington team had come early, marked trees, sprayed accelerant. They hadn't lit anything yet, but they were ready. The fox stared at them for one long second, then turned and vanished toward the site. Claire and Caleb ran. When they reached the clearing, the men were still unpacking gear. One had a map spread over the hood of the SUV. Another held a spray can marking routes. Caleb stepped into the open. "Put that down." The men looked up. The leader, same square-jawed man from before, didn't flinch. "You're trespassing," Caleb said. "No," the man replied, cool as glass. "You are." Then he lifted a hand and froze, because behind Caleb, behind the trees, behind the mist, they came, foxes, not just a few, not dozens, hundreds, silent, motionless, forming a wide semicircle behind the clearing. No sound, no growling, no barking, just presence, from behind trees, on fallen logs, on hillsides, eyes gleaming like stars. The Carrington men backed away instinctively. "What the hell?" one whispered. Then the black fox stepped forward, straight toward the SUV. It didn't rush, it didn't snarl, it walked, confident, measured. It stopped 2 feet from the nearest man and looked up, then sat and waited. The man dropped the flagging tape from his hand. Caleb stepped beside the fox, Claire behind him. No one spoke. No one needed to. The message was louder than fire. This land is not yours, and the wild does not forget. The Carrington team left that morning. No legal fight, no press release, just silence. They returned to the world beyond the trees, to places where stories were just stories, and foxes were just shadows in fairy tales. But they would never forget what they saw, because in that clearing, in that stillness, the forest had spoken back. Weeks passed. The southern boundary was reseeded with native plants. Claire placed a carved stone marker at the site. She stood, and we listened. Caleb added another. Truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits in fur and silence. The black fox was seen often after that, never close, never predictable, but always near the line, like a watcher, a reminder, a promise. That winter, a letter arrived, unsigned, no return address. Inside, a photo, old, faded, of a man with sharp eyes kneeling in a snowy forest, a black fox at his side, and scribbled beneath it, "She comes back for those who need her, and she stays for the ones who remember." Claire framed it, hung it on the back wall of the Welcome Center, and every evening, before locking up, she would pause and look at it, just for a second, and whisper, "We remember." And somewhere out in the dark, beneath stars older than fences or maps or ownership, a tail flicked once through the snow and vanished. Claire didn't say goodbye when she left Elijah's crossing. She didn't need to. She'd spent decades walking the same trails, planting trees, listening more than speaking. The sanctuary didn't belong to her. It belonged to the forest, and now it belonged to Caleb. She left before dawn, leaving only a journal page pinned to her cabin door. Sometimes the wild doesn't need saving. It just needs someone to say, "I see you. Keep going." That spring, a stone appeared beneath the apple tree, smooth, round, carved simply EW, and on the back, "We are not lost. We just changed shape." No one had placed it there, but Caleb understood. The forest remembered. The foxes came early that year. A new one led the way, golden, silent, and unafraid. She brought pups with her. She didn't run from Caleb. She only watched, and he welcomed her. A year later, they opened a new trail, the ash line. At the end stood a bench and a plaque. She came first. She stayed longest. She left everything better than she found it. Visitors said it felt different there. Some said they heard paws in the leaves. Others simply closed their eyes and listened. One autumn morning, a little girl visited with her father. She drew in the moss circle and before leaving whispered to no one, "Thank you for watching me sleep." When asked, she just smiled. "The fox told me in my dream." She knew my name. That night, Caleb walked the grove. He paused as moonlight touched the trees. Eyes blinked in the dark. Gold, then gone. He didn't chase. He only smiled, because he knew what the forest was saying. We're still here, watching, listening, and when the world forgets again, we'll remind it.